So now I'm going to talk to you about presentations. And this is really my perspective on presentations, so don't take this as the truth in all of this, but try and figure out from this what are invaluable and useful comments for you in your own presentations. So I'm going to start out talking about three things. Why are you giving a presentation? So what is the context for somebody deciding it's worth everyone's time to have you stand up in front of them and present? What you should have in a presentation. So this is a lot about the structure of the presentation, and finally how you should present. So how you should deal with people, deal with the audience, keep yourself calm, that sort of stuff. I'm then going to go on and go through a list of my pet peeves. These are things that people do in presentations that drive me nuts, and you should try to avoid them in general, but you should try specifically to avoid them if you're presenting for me. And finally, in this part of the course here, you're going to see a bunch of other perspectives on presenting. So I've gone through and tried to find some other people talking about presentations so that you can get some other perspectives on what to do and what not to do. So let's get started. Why are you giving a presentation? Why has somebody decided that you need to stand up in front of a whole bunch of people and talk about something? What makes people want to do that? So what do you think? Is the topic important? Do you have special knowledge? The most efficient way? Which of these things have to be true before it makes sense for you to give a presentation? Well, all of them pretty much. You've got to have an important topic. You're bringing a lot of people together. That's a lot of time. You yourself had better have some special knowledge. Otherwise, what would be the point in having you talk about it? If everybody knows this stuff, there's no need to discuss it. Also, this has to be a pretty efficient way to do this. If it was easier for people to just go read the email or the web page, then they wouldn't have you do a presentation. So all these things have to come together before it makes sense to do a presentation. So this implies a few things here. So first of all, it implies that the content is important. So the stuff that you're presenting is not just arbitrary things. This is important to somebody. Somebody's prepared to spend a lot of time. And if you think about this, if you have a meeting with 20 people in it that lasts an hour, that's 20 hours of time that were spent in that meeting. That's half a week's worth of work time for one person. So giving a presentation means something's important. Also, your specific knowledge has to be important about this thing. If you were chosen to give the presentation, that means you have some special knowledge, or you're expected to get some special knowledge about this material. And finally, time is valuable. If the most efficient way to learn this stuff and disseminate it is to have one person go through the effort to put together a presentation to spread it to others, that means the other people have important things to do. And so you want to focus on this. You don't want to waste people's time in a presentation. So if all these things are true, why don't we just have people going off and reading the report or the paper or the web page or figuring this stuff out themselves? Why are we doing a presentation? Well, it may be hard to extract the key ideas. So your job in the presentation is to figure out from all this material, what are the key ideas? It may be hard to get questions answered. So people may have questions about this and it would take them a long time to figure them out. Your job is to figure out all that stuff so you can answer the questions. And it may be hard to see why it's important. So there may be a bigger picture here where you need to figure out what is it about this material that's important, and that's your job. Your job in the presentation is to go through and figure out what is the bigger picture, why is this important. So if you look at this list here, it says there are several things that are important about why you would do a presentation. Does this apply if you're doing a presentation in a class? Well, the answer here is yes. The class is just practice for the real thing. If you don't act as if these things are important and treat your presentation this way, you won't be ready when the time comes to give a presentation that, I don't know, your job depends on, or something that's actually important. So take it seriously and put in a good effort, even if it's in a class situation. All right, so what I just said in the previous slide all adds up to one thing. You are the expert. That's why you've been asked to present. Your job is to extract the key ideas, and you need to efficiently convey them. So again, don't waste the audience time. You're the expert, figure out what the important things are and get them across. So you need to identify this and you need to package it. That is, you need to put it together in a way that efficiently conveys this information. You also need to be able to answer questions. Again, you're the expert. You should have gone through this and understood the material to the point where if somebody asks you a question, you can answer it. And this is simply because it's more time efficient to ask you than to have everyone in the room go and figure out their stuff. So again, here's this time efficiency, not wasting time again. So you need to be prepared to answer questions. And this means you've got to become the expert if you're not already. And finally, you're expected to identify why this topic is important. You're supposed to give a presentation on something. You better figure out why it's important, and not just why it's important in general, but why it's important specifically. So you need to get to the core insights. And this is sort of what's new or valuable. So if there's something going on that you're giving a presentation about, it's probably because not everybody knows about it. This implies it's new, something's changed, or there's some value that's been seen in it. So someone decided you're responsible, so you have to figure this out. If everyone in the room was going to figure this out themselves, you wouldn't need to do a presentation. The key thing to think about here is explaining the big picture, but it's also in the audience's context. So if you're explaining a new technique or say a new library for a programmer, and you're explaining it to a bunch of programmers, you're going to have a very different big picture than if you're explaining a new library to a bunch of managers. So for the programmer, the big picture might be what it allows them to do. For a manager, it might be what it allows them to save money on, or where they can be more efficient. So basically, if you look across all of these things, you're presenting because you're the expert. So somebody's decided that it's a better use of the company's time to have you present because you're an expert on this material. And of course, that means if you're not an expert, you'd better become one quickly. And this is why you get an education, so that you can learn stuff quickly and figure them out. All right, so what should you have in a presentation? Well, obviously, it's going to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And this forms sort of the basis for the structure. And let's talk a little bit about what goes in each of these pieces. So the beginning needs to address what is the issue and why is it important. So when you start off your presentation, people need to understand what you're going to talk about and why they should care about it. In the middle of the presentation, you need to focus on what's new. That is, what's changed, what is the value. So is something getting better or worse? Why is it interesting? All of a sudden, what's going on that caused the presentation? So everybody's going to be familiar with this issue. And you telling them it's important is just making sure that they understand they should listen to you. This part here is saying, why are we having a presentation now? What has changed and why is it important? When you get to the end of your presentation, you need to explain to people why this was worth their time. Again, getting back to we don't want to waste people's time. Presentations are supposed to be an efficient way to disseminate information. So what should the audience remember? They just sat and listened to you for a while, so at the end, please remind them what are the key points? What should they take away? If there's one thing they remember from this presentation, what should it be? Now, another way to think about this is the beginning is the motivation. It's the thing that motivates people to pay attention and think what you're talking about is important. The middle is the contribution. So this is what did you do or what has somebody else done that has changed things or is new. And the end here is the conclusion. This is simply what should you remember? What's the key point? How do these things come together and what should people remember from it? So let's take a look at an example here. Here's an outline of a presentation. It's about how to bake a cookie. The first part of the presentation is going to be on choosing the ingredients, and there are a bunch of subpoints. Then we're going to talk about mixing, some subpoints, and baking, and finally cooling. So if we look at this here, we can see that in this presentation here, we need a beginning, middle, and end. And the question I want to ask is, does this subsection here, mixing, does mixing itself need a beginning, a middle, and an end? Well, the answer here is yeah, it does. Every piece of a presentation has a beginning, a middle, and end. The whole presentation, each section, and even each slide. So if you look at this slide, what's the beginning and the middle and the end? Well, the beginning is we need a structure. And what's the end? The end is that every piece of the presentation has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The middle here, well, this is this contribution. It's the new part here, what we're going on here. So everything in your slide should have this. And if you can't figure out what the beginning, middle, and end of each part of your presentation is, you're going to have a hard time delivering it because you're not going to know how to start off each part. You're not going to know why people should care about it, and you're not going to know what people should remember from it. And if you can't identify the beginning, middle, and end for any part of your presentation, it probably doesn't belong there. All right, so you can have structure in your presentation, and you as the presenter should always know where you're going and where it fits in, but you're going to find the audience doesn't always follow, so you need to help the audience along. And one of the important things to do here is to tie the details together. So in a presentation, you usually start at a high level and you dive into something. And when you return from it, you need to tie it back together again. So let's take a look at an example. So here's our presentation about baking cookies. And we need to do this when we're going into mixing. So when I go from choosing ingredients to mixing, I'm now going to dive into mixing in detail and talk just about that, but without the context of the bigger picture here of choosing the ingredients and baking. So when I start doing mixing here, I need to put it in context. I need to start out by saying, now we're going to talk about mixing. This is the next step after choosing the ingredients, and it puts the ingredients together. And it's very important to get this right, because if you don't do the mixing right, when we go into baking, we're going to have problems. So by doing that, I've reminded the audience of the context of this before I dive into the details. And you need to do the same thing when you pop back up again here. So at the end of mixing, I need to stop and say, okay, now we've discussed mixing. And as you've seen from mixing, we need to get the ingredients in the right order and work them together. And the reason this is important because when we move on to baking, if we haven't done it correctly, we're going to have problems with the baking. So again, when I jump down into these details and when I come back up to the higher level, I need to remind the audience of the context of these details. So these details in here need to be put into the right context. All right, a very important point here is that every slide should have a point. You would think this is obvious, but you'd be surprised how many people present slides that don't really have a point, or where they don't know what the point is. And usually the title should say what that is. So what's the point of this slide? Well, simply every slide should have a point. That's the point of this slide. Now, if you don't have the point of the slide in the title, you're in trouble. There are a few exceptions to that, and it's mostly when you're teasing the audience or trying to make a joke, but you really want to make it clear that when they read the title of the slide, they should know what they're going to get out of this slide. The other part of this is every slide should end with why the stuff on the slide is important. So why is it important that every slide should have a point? Well, here we go. Let's end with it. If it doesn't, your audience won't know what they should listen to. So this slide's point is every slide should have a point, and the reason that's important is the audience won't know why they should listen if you don't have that. This actually forms a really good way to help you prepare for your presentation. So if you look at each of your slides and you can identify the point and the conclusion for every slide by just looking at them, then that means you've got a good understanding of your presentation and you're probably pretty well prepared for it. Corollary is if you can't identify the point and conclusion immediately when looking at a slide, you probably haven't prepared enough. All right, so how should you go about actually doing your presentation? Well, I'm going to divide this into 3 parts: pacing, support, and presence. So pacing, this is how you speak. You should be easy to follow but not boring. So not too slow, but you shouldn't be so excited that it's hard to follow. And this is really about practice. What I do is I practice my presentation until it's a little bit faster than the amount of time I have. Then when I go to give the presentation, I know I can relax a little bit. And relaxing a little bit here plus the adrenaline of the presentation usually gets me to just about the right amount of time. Support, this is your material. So if you're using on-screen material, it should support you, not distract. You don't want to have too much stuff on the screen. Particularly, you don't want to just read what's on the screen. If you notice here, I'm going through these and I'm getting through all the content here, but I'm elaborating on them. This is the key point. Don't just read what's on the screen, but I'm telling you more about that. You should not just read what's on the screen. You should provide more information to the viewer. Similarly, don't make the audience read the screen. Don't put up a lot of text that you expect the audience to read. Don't put up charts where you expect them to figure it out on their own. You've got to lead them through it. This is your material supporting you, not distracting. If you show a graph, you should walk them through it. If you show text, you should explain the text and elaborate on it. For your presence, make sure your speech is clear. Getting clear speech is mostly about knowing where the key phrases and points are. So what are the things that you want to put the emphasis on in your presentation? You can also make eye contact, and this is very helpful to make it seem like a more personal presentation. If you don't do this naturally, just force yourself. Every 5 or 10 seconds, force yourself to look at another person in the room. You'll very quickly get into the habit of making eye contact with the whole audience. And finally, be comfortable with your material. The only way to get here is by practicing, and so you really got to practice to be comfortable. If you are comfortable with your material, your audience will immediately know that and understand that it is a much better presentation. All right, so how can you get comfortable with your material? Well, practice. Just go ahead and practice it. Sit down, do the presentation a bunch of times, and then practice some more. It's really practice that gets you there. But don't memorize what to say. So don't write down the words and try to learn them. Practice what's going on and make sure you hit the key points. So there are some things you should memorize. So you should memorize the key point for each slide. So when you see a slide, you should have in your head exactly what the key point is. Now, if you've done this right, the key point should probably be what's in the title. So that's actually going to be pretty easy to do. Do memorize what's on the next slide and how to do the transition. So you know what's coming up next. So I know what's coming up next. It's my slide about pet peeves. And how am I going to do the transition? Well, the pet peeves are sort of a joke, so when I get to the end of this, I'm going to tell you this stuff is really important. Now we're going to go on to something a little bit less important. So memorize what's on the next slide so you know what's coming next and how to transition between them. Finally, do memorize where to put emphasis, which words are important and where you put pauses. If you put all of these things together, the rest will fall out naturally. So if you've learned these three things here, if you've memorized these three things and somebody interrupts you to ask a question, it's not a problem because you know what was the key point for the slide, you know what's coming next, and you know where you want to put your emphasis. You can start right off again without any problem. If you need to speed up or slow down, it's no problem because you can just hit on the key point and go right on to the next slide. You know which are the parts that you need to emphasize. These are really the key things to learn, and once you learn these, you become comfortable with your presentation. All right, so here are my pet peeves, and as I said a moment ago, these are less serious. So these are things that drive me nuts, and if you're presenting for me, you probably want to avoid them, but in general, you should think about these carefully. So don't ever show a full screen of text at once. If I filled up this whole screen with text, you'd just be reading through it and you'd be ignoring what I'd say. Use the animations to have the text appear. So here I am, I'm talking about this text and here it is. Now I'm going to go on to talk about the next part and there it is. Showing something you don't talk about is a terrible idea. Don't make me look at something if you're not going to focus on it. If you show a graph with 2 lines on it, you'd better need both of those lines for your description. If not, you should have gotten rid of one of the lines. Don't apologize. There's really no excuse for this. You need to prepare and you need to be ready to go. That said, if you haven't prepared, don't say anything. If you apologize, you're just focusing me on what you haven't done or what you're not ready for. If you don't say anything, I probably won't notice as much. And even if you do say something, I sort of expect you to prepare, so that doesn't really help. Sloppy appearance. This is particularly hard if you're in school, but do think about this. If you put a bunch of time, I put about 2 hours or more into a presentation, go ahead and put on some nice clothes. It is really disturbing. It's a shocking difference in how you're received if you're dressed up nicely. This is incredibly important. It's sort of depressing. We'd like to think that we're judged based on our content, not our appearance, but we're judged based on the whole package, and appearance really does make a big difference. And finally, sort of the worst thing you can do a presentation is give too much detail and not enough perspective. I'm going to forget your details, and I'm going to forget them primarily because I know I can look them up. If I know what the important stuff is, the big picture issues, I know I can always look up the details. The value you give me in your presentation is the big picture. You are having thought about what's going on and told me what's important. This is the stuff that's hard to look up. So if you're going to do one thing that you're really going to focus on your presentation, make sure you give the perspective on it and you give pointers to the details so that people can go through and they can understand why this is important, and then they can go back and they know where to look if they need the detail.